It was a cool and crisp afternoon in downtown Philadelphia, the kind of day where the golden sunlight played gently on the city's historic buildings. In the heart of the bustling city, a quiet church stood as a sanctuary from the chaos outside. Inside, the tranquility was palpable. The stained glass windows, masterpieces of color and light, filtered the afternoon sun, casting intricate, shimmering patterns across the cool marble floor. A faint, soothing melody from a piano echoed softly through the space, wrapping the room in an almost ethereal calm. A handful of people were scattered throughout the church. Some knelt in prayer, their heads bowed and hands clasped tightly. Others sat silently in the pews, their eyes fixed on open Bibles, lips moving slightly as they mouthed verses. A few simply stared into the distance, lost in private moments of reflection and contemplation. The atmosphere was heavy with reverence, yet there was an undeniable sense of solace that enveloped everyone within those hallowed walls. Barron Trump sat in the third row from the front, close to the center aisle. His tall frame was slightly hunched over, his hands cradling an open Bible on his lap. He had chosen this spot deliberately, not too close to the altar to draw attention, yet not so far back as to seem disengaged. His white shirt and simple khaki pants blended seamlessly into the modest setting. At first glance, there was nothing to set him apart from anyone else in the room, but anyone who recognized him would know the truth. Barron Trump, the youngest son of a former president, rarely escaped the glare of public scrutiny. He wasn't here to make a statement or court attention. He was here for something much simpler, yet infinitely more elusive: peace. Growing up in the public eye had taught him the cost of fame, the relentless judgment of the world, and the weight of expectations that seemed to press down on his every move. But here, surrounded by the simplicity of wooden pews and the faint aroma of melted candle wax, he felt a calm he rarely found elsewhere. This was a place where his name didn't matter, where he could just be. Barron's fingers gently turned a page of his Bible, the soft rustle almost imperceptible in the stillness. He was focused on the text in front of him, his mind tracing the familiar words as though seeking guidance from their meaning. The world outside seemed far away, its chaos unable to penetrate this sacred refuge. But then, without warning, the peace was shattered. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the church swung open with a thunderous bang, their sudden movement echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. The sharp noise cut through the delicate stillness like a knife, drawing every pair of eyes toward the entrance. Even the soft piano music faltered, the melody breaking off as if startled. A man stepped inside, his presence commanding immediate attention. He appeared to be in his early 40s, his disheveled appearance a stark contrast to the serene setting. His face was lined with tension, his eyes ablaze with an intensity that seemed to burn hotter with every step he took. Dressed in worn, practical clothes, he carried an air of someone hardened by life's struggles. His gaze swept the room, briefly taking in the faces turned toward him, before locking onto Barron. Without hesitation, he raised an accusing finger, his voice slicing through the stunned silence. "Who do you think you are? Sitting here like you have the right?" The words hung in the air, heavy and charged, their harshness reverberating throughout the sanctuary. The congregation froze, their movements suspended as if time itself had paused. A few exchanged nervous glances, their expressions a mix of confusion and alarm. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. Barron's head lifted slowly, his calm demeanor unchanged even as the man's fiery accusation rang out. His expression betrayed neither fear nor anger, only a quiet curiosity, as though he were trying to understand the pain that lay beneath the stranger's outburst. The church, once so serene, now felt charged with a tension that crackled like static in the air. The sacred space seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The voice was sharp and powerful, cutting through the sacred stillness of the church like a knife. It immediately shattered the tranquil atmosphere, replacing it with tension so palpable that everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath. The man who had spoken stood in the doorway, his presence as commanding as the sound of the large wooden doors slamming open moments earlier. He appeared to be in his early 40s, his face deeply lined with traces of hardship and anger that no amount of time could erase. The light streaming through the stained glass windows caught the rough texture of his modest clothing, a faded flannel shirt and worn jeans, accentuating the ruggedness of his appearance. His eyes blazed with a fire that had clearly been stoked by years of suffering, and every muscle in his body seemed coiled with tension. The congregation, initially startled by the noise, now turned their attention to him, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. Even the priest, seated near the altar with a leather-bound book of liturgy in his hands, paused mid-page to glance toward the disruption. Barron Trump sat motionless in the third row, his tall frame hunched slightly over an open Bible. The man's words had sliced through the peaceful air, but Barron did not flinch. Instead, he froze in place for a moment, his dark eyes lifting from the pages of Scripture, not out of fear, but in visible surprise. He studied the man for a few seconds, his expression unreadable, before slowly closing the Bible and placing it gently on the pew beside him. The man's voice, hoarse yet unwavering, filled the room again, carrying with it the weight of his pain and anger. He took a few deliberate steps closer to Barron, his boots clicking against the marble floor. His movements were unhurried but deliberate, like a predator approaching its prey. "You have everything," the man spat, his voice trembling with fury. "Everything others have to beg for, cry for, sacrifice their entire lives to get. Do you even know what it feels like to lose it all?" A sharp inhale could be heard from someone seated nearby, a woman clutching a rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. A young couple exchanged uneasy glances but remained seated, unsure whether to intervene. Barron straightened slightly in his seat, his composure steady despite the man's growing intensity. He could feel the eyes of the congregation on him, their collective tension weighing down the air. Slowly, he stood, his tall frame towering over the man now only a few feet away. Yet, there was no arrogance in his posture, only quiet strength. The silence stretched for a moment, broken only by the faint rustling of someone shifting in their pew. Finally, Barron's voice emerged, calm and steady, each word deliberate and sincere. "Sir," he began, his tone soft but firm, "I don't know what has troubled you so deeply, but if you're willing, I'd like to hear your story." His words hung in the air, unexpected and disarming. The man blinked, caught off guard by the lack of hostility in Barron's response. His clenched fists loosened slightly, but his face remained hardened with anger. The room seemed to shift subtly, the tension transforming into a quiet anticipation. The others in the church leaned in, as if drawn by the weight of the moment. Barron's gaze never wavered from the man's, his eyes reflecting something that was neither pity nor judgment, but genuine curiosity and empathy. For the first time since his outburst, the man hesitated. He glanced around the sanctuary, his fiery glare softening just enough to reveal the exhaustion behind it. His body remained rigid, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, as though he wasn't sure whether to unleash the storm raging within him or to finally let it go. Barron waited, his patience unwavering, his hands resting loosely at his sides. His calm demeanor was like a mirror, reflecting back the man's anger but refusing to absorb it. The man's lips tightened into a thin line, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might turn and walk away. But he didn't. Instead, he took one more step forward, his shoulders slumping slightly as though the weight of his own emotions was beginning to crush him. His voice, still rough but quieter now, broke the silence once more. "You don't understand," he muttered, the fire in his tone now mixed with something closer to despair. "You can't understand. People like you, people with your kind of life, you don't know what it's like to lose everything." Barron's expression remained calm, his dark eyes steady and kind. "You might be surprised," he said softly. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the man falter again. He looked at Barron as if searching for some crack in his composure, something to confirm his assumptions about the young man in front of him. But he found nothing. The church seemed to hold its breath once more, waiting for what would come next. Barron's words hung in the air, stilling the tension-filled church. Everyone seemed frozen, caught in the gravity of the moment. A few people exchanged uneasy glances, their faces etched with uncertainty, wondering if they should step in or let the interaction play out. The man in front of Barron, his stance rigid and defiant, let out a bitter chuckle. The sound was sharp and hollow, cutting through the silence like shattered glass. "Hear my story," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "You think someone like you could possibly understand?" Barron didn't react to the man's sarcasm. He remained calm, his expression composed, almost serene, though his eyes reflected something deeper, compassion, perhaps, or curiosity. With a subtle gesture, he motioned toward the pew beside him. "Please, have a seat," Barron said, his voice steady but inviting. "If you feel like no one understands, maybe it's time to share." The man stood there, unmoving, as if trying to decide whether to lash out or accept the invitation. His eyes bored into Barron's, scrutinizing him, searching for any sign of insincerity. His fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles white, as though he was holding back the storm raging within him. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, the air thick with anticipation. After what felt like an eternity, the man exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging just slightly. Slowly, reluctantly, he stepped forward and sat down on the pew, the wooden bench groaning under his weight. The creak echoed in the quiet sanctuary, blending with the soft murmur of a distant piano still playing faintly in the background. "Fine," he muttered, his voice lower but no less bitter. "You want to hear my story? I'll tell you, but don't expect it to make you feel any better." Barron nodded, leaning slightly forward in his seat, his gaze unwavering as he watched the man settle in. There was no rush, no pressure, only patience. The man hesitated, his hands resting heavily on his knees. They were rough and calloused, marked by years of hard labor, and now they trembled slightly as he tightened them into fists. After a moment, he leaned forward, as if bracing himself for the weight of his own words. "I used to have a job," he began, his voice rough, carrying the weight of years of frustration and sorrow. "A family, a stable life, nothing fancy, but it was enough." He paused, his eyes distant, as though looking at a memory that had grown faint with time. "Then the factory I worked at shut down. Just like that. Everything was gone. Hundreds of us, men and women who'd spent years building our lives there, were left behind with nothing but empty promises of new opportunities." The bitterness in his tone deepened, and his lips curled into a humorless smile. "Those promises never came true." His words resonated in the stillness of the church, their weight palpable. Those sitting nearby listened intently, their own quiet reflections momentarily forgotten. "I tried," he continued, his voice cracking slightly as he pressed on. "I tried to keep it together for my wife and kids. Took whatever odd jobs I could find. Mowing lawns, fixing fences, hauling junk. It wasn't much, but I thought it would be enough to keep us afloat." He paused, his shoulders slumping further. "But when you're just scraping by, It only takes one little thing, just one, to knock you down for good. My wife, she couldn't take it anymore. She packed up and left. Took the kids with her. Told me she couldn't live like that anymore." He let out a shaky breath, his voice growing softer. "I can't even blame her for it." Barron remained silent, his face unreadable, but his eyes reflected a quiet empathy that didn't require words. The man let out another bitter laugh, this one quieter, tinged with despair. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the grain of the wooden pew, as if searching for something solid in the midst of his pain. "You know what it's like?" he asked, his voice trembling now. "To walk into a place like this and feel every single set of eyes on you? To know they're judging you, looking at you like you're nothing?" His words hung in the air, heavy and raw, their impact reaching not just Barron but everyone within earshot. A woman a few pews away tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. A man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering toward the ground. "That's my life," the man continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Every single day. And then I see you," he added, his tone sharpening again as his gaze locked onto Barron, sitting there, dressed nice, reading your Bible like you don't have a care in the world. And it makes me angry, because no matter what I do, no matter how hard I try, I'll never have what you have." Barron didn't flinch under the weight of the man's words. He let the silence stretch, allowing the man's pain to echo through the sanctuary without interruption. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and deeply thoughtful. "I don't know what it's like to live your life," Barron said gently, his words deliberate, "but I do know what it's like to be judged. To feel like people have decided who you are before you've had a chance to say anything at all." The man's head lifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Barron with renewed intensity. "What could you possibly know about that?" he demanded, his voice carrying both skepticism and curiosity. Barron's answer was not immediate. He held the man's gaze, his own expression unchanging, as if weighing his next words carefully. The tension in the room shifted again, the congregation leaning in closer to the unfolding moment, waiting to see what would happen next. Barron took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders as he met the man's gaze. His voice, steady but sincere, carried through the quiet sanctuary, each word deliberate and carefully chosen. "You might think my life is easy because of my name," Barron began, his tone calm but firm. "And yes, in some ways, you're not wrong. I've never had to worry about having a roof over my head or food on the table. I've been blessed in ways many people haven't." He paused, letting the admission linger, his eyes steady and unwavering. "But that doesn't mean I don't know what it feels like to be misunderstood." The man's posture remained rigid, his jaw tight as he listened, but the sharpness in his eyes seemed to dull slightly. Barron noticed the shift, subtle though it was, and continued with a quiet conviction that carried the weight of his own experiences. "Everywhere I go," he said, his voice softening, "people make assumptions about me. They think they know who I am, what I've done, what kind of person I must be, just because they know my last name. To them, I'm not a person. I'm a symbol, a target, someone to project their anger onto. It doesn't matter what I say or do. They've already decided who I am, just like what's happening here." Barron's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of fabric as a woman in the back shifted in her seat. The man didn't respond right away, but something in his face began to change. The tension that had drawn his features into a mask of anger slowly began to ease. His shoulders, hunched as if bracing for a fight, started to relax. His hands, which had been gripping his knees with white-knuckled intensity, unclenched and rested more loosely. Barron didn't push, giving the man time to absorb what he had said. When he spoke again, His voice carried a deep gentleness, a kind of quiet understanding that seemed to resonate in the stillness of the church. "I'm not here to argue with you," Barron said, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "I'm not here to change your mind or tell you that you're wrong for feeling the way you do. I just want to understand." The man looked up at Barron, his eyes searching, his expression a mix of lingering doubt and a flicker of something else, curiosity, perhaps, or a cautious openness. "Because I believe," Barron continued, his tone steady but compassionate. "We all carry pain that others can't see. We all have struggles, burdens that weigh us down, that shape how we see the world. And if we could understand that, if we could see each other's pain, maybe we'd treat each other with a little more kindness." A heavy sigh escaped the man's lips, breaking the silence like a slow exhale of a long-held breath. It was the kind of sigh that came not from exhaustion, but from release, the letting go of something too heavy to bear any longer. He lowered his head, his gaze fixed on the polished marble floor beneath his feet. The anger that had once burned so fiercely in his eyes was gone, replaced by something quieter, softer. "You're not what I expected," the man murmured after a long pause, his voice rough but subdued. His words were almost an admission, spoken more to himself than to Barron. Barron didn't reply immediately. He let the man's words settle into the space between them, respecting the vulnerability they carried. Around them, the atmosphere in the church seemed to shift. There was a warmth now, a sense of connection that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the man who had changed. Everyone in the church, from the elderly woman with the rosary to the young couple in the back, seemed to feel it too. This wasn't just a conversation between two people. It was a moment that had touched everyone present. In this sacred space, amidst the flickering candlelight and the faint strains of piano music, they had all borne witness to something rare and profound, a raw, honest exchange of pain, empathy, and hope, a reminder that even in our differences, we are not as divided as we might think. The man leaned back against the worn wooden pew, his shoulders sagging as though he had finally set down an invisible burden. In the quiet corner of the church, away from the curious eyes of the congregation, his entire demeanor shifted. The tense, defensive posture he'd carried moments ago dissolved, replaced by something softer, something almost contemplative. It was as if the outside world, with all its chaos and pain, had momentarily ceased to exist within the sacred stillness of this place. The flickering candlelight on the altar danced faintly in his sunken eyes, casting shadows that seemed to mirror the deep lines of hardship etched into his face. His hands, rough and calloused from years of labor, rested loosely on his thighs now, no longer clenched into fists. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, his silence filling the space like an unspoken prayer. The church seemed to respond in kind, holding its breath in reverence for the unspoken emotions hovering in the air. Even the faint notes of the piano, still playing softly in the distance, seemed more subdued, as if respecting the gravity of the moment. At last, the man's voice broke the stillness. It was different now, not sharp and biting as before, but raw, stripped of the anger that had once laced every word. There was a trembling honesty in it, like a long-sealed door creaking open for the first time. "You know," he began, his voice low and unsteady, "I came here carrying anger toward the whole world." He paused, bowing his head as if the weight of his own confession was too heavy to bear. His shoulders sagged further, his body seeming smaller now, not with weakness, but with surrender. "I was angry at people like you," he continued, his words slower now, deliberate. "People who seem to have everything handed to them, who never have to fight for it." He exhaled heavily, the sound filled with years of pent-up frustration. "But maybe Maybe I've been holding on to that anger for too long. And maybe it has nothing to do with you at all." His words lingered in the air, raw and unfiltered, hanging there as if daring anyone to interrupt. But there was no interruption, only a respectful silence. Barron, seated a few pews away, didn't respond immediately. He let the man's words settle, watching as they seemed to echo back to him in the sacred stillness of the church. His gaze shifted from the man to the statue of Jesus on the cross at the front of the sanctuary. The soft glow of candlelight illuminated the figure, its outstretched arms a quiet reminder of grace and redemption. When Barron finally spoke, his voice was steady and calm, carrying with it a quiet understanding. "It's easy to blame people we don't really know," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "To look at someone else's life and think we have them all figured out. But it's much harder to face what's truly hurting our own hearts." He paused, his dark eyes meeting the man's for the first time. There was no judgment in his gaze, only compassion. "Today, you've done that. You've faced it, and I respect you for it." The man looked up at Barron fully now, and for the first time, their eyes met without barriers. The hostility and resentment that had once burned in the man's expression were gone, replaced by something deeper, something quieter. It was gratitude, weary and reluctant but unmistakable, as though part of the burden he had carried for so long had finally been lifted. "You're a good man," the man said after a long pause, his voice softer now, almost reluctant. The words seemed to come from somewhere deep within him, a place he rarely let others see. "I don't say that often," he admitted, his tone carrying a hint of vulnerability, "but I think you need to hear it." Barron didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, his expression thoughtful, his posture relaxed but attentive. Around them, the church seemed to breathe again. The atmosphere, once heavy with tension and anger, now felt lighter, as though the simple act of speaking and listening had transformed the air itself. The man shifted slightly in his seat, his hands once again tracing the grain of the wooden pew. He glanced toward the altar, the flickering candles reflected in his tired eyes. For the first time, he seemed at peace, not entirely free of the weight he carried, but perhaps willing to set it down for a while. The faint murmur of prayers resumed in the background, blending with the soft music as the church began to reclaim its tranquil rhythm. Yet, for those who had been close enough to hear, the moment remained etched in their minds, a quiet but profound reminder of the power of empathy and the courage it takes to let go of anger. The man's words hung in the air, their impact reverberating through the tranquil sanctuary. It was as though the very walls of the church had absorbed the raw sincerity in his voice, reflecting it back into the hearts of those who had gathered there. Nearby, a woman lowered her rosary, her lips parting slightly in silent contemplation. A young couple sitting in the back exchanged a glance. Their expressions softened. Even the faint breeze drifting in through the stained glass windows seemed to carry the weight of the moment, blending with the sacred stillness now infused with unspoken emotion. Then, the man did something that no one expected. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his hand toward Barron. It was a gesture as simple as it was profound, his rough, calloused hand reaching out, bridging the space between them. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, every eye in the church turning toward the scene. Barron hesitated only briefly, his own hand pausing in midair as though acknowledging the significance of the moment. Then, with quiet confidence, he took the man's hand in a firm and sincere grip. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. Each word carried the weight of years of anger and regret now finally finding release. "For judging you before I understood you." Barron's lips curved into a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. His voice was calm, yet deeply empathetic as he replied, "And I'm sorry if I ever made you feel that way." The handshake lingered longer than expected, a silent exchange of understanding and forgiveness that transcended words. When the man finally released his grip, he stood up, his movements slightly awkward as he adjusted his worn jacket. His gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of those who had witnessed the exchange. "I think I owe everyone here an apology too," he said, his voice louder now, steady enough to carry across the sanctuary. "I came in here filled with anger I didn't know what to do with. But this young man," he glanced down at Barron, his expression softening, "he reminded me that sometimes we just need to stop and listen." The room remained silent for a beat, the weight of his words settling over the congregation. Then, one by one, people began to clap. It wasn't raucous applause, but a gentle, meaningful gesture, a collective acknowledgement of the humility and courage it took for the man to speak those words. The man nodded slightly, his face reflecting a mix of emotion. It was clear he hadn't expected the reaction, and for a moment, he seemed almost overcome by it. He turned to leave, his steps deliberate as he made his way toward the large wooden doors of the church. But just before stepping outside, he paused and glanced back at Barron. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady but filled with genuine gratitude. Barron met his gaze with a small nod, his expression serene but thoughtful. The man hesitated for just a moment longer, then pushed the doors open and disappeared into the fading light beyond. The congregation sat in silence, the echoes of his footsteps fading into the sacred stillness once more. Yet, something had shifted in the atmosphere. It was as though the raw honesty and reconciliation they had just witnessed had left an indelible mark, a reminder of the power of empathy and the courage it took to reach across the divides we so often build between ourselves. The church gradually settled back into its serene quiet, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. The air seemed warmer, almost tangible, with an unspoken understanding that had passed between those who had been present for the exchange. A few people exchanged soft smiles, their faces reflecting a newfound peace, while others bowed their heads in silent prayer, their expressions gentler than before. It was as if the moment they had just witnessed had awakened something in everyone, a reminder of shared humanity. Barron, who had remained standing for a moment after the man's departure, finally returned to his seat. He picked up the small, well-worn Bible that had been resting on his lap, running his fingers over its cover as though grounding himself in its familiarity. The light streaming through the stained glass windows fell over him in patches, adding a quiet radiance to the sacred space around him. Before he could fully refocus on the pages before him, a soft shuffling of footsteps approached. Barron looked up to see an older woman standing nearby. She appeared to be in her 60s, her face framed by silver-streaked hair, her eyes kind, and her smile warm. She held a small rosary in her hands, its beads glinting faintly in the light. "Young man," she began gently, her voice quiet but filled with an undeniable warmth. "You just did something very meaningful." Barron shifted slightly in his seat, surprised but attentive as she continued. "You didn't have to listen to him," she said, nodding toward the door where the man had exited. "But you did. And I think you reminded all of us here of something important, that sometimes kindness alone is enough to change the world." Her words carried a weight far greater than their simplicity suggested. Barron blinked, momentarily taken aback by her sincerity. He nodded, his expression humble, his voice quiet but steady. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, his tone filled with genuine gratitude. I think all of us just want to be heard and understood." The woman smiled again, a gesture so tender and heartfelt it seemed to light up her entire face. Reaching out, she placed a hand on Barron's shoulder, a gesture of gratitude, encouragement, and perhaps even a quiet blessing. "You're a good young man," she said softly before retreating to her seat. Barron watched her go, his heart unexpectedly full. Around him, the gentle murmurs of prayer resumed, weaving through the stillness like a quiet hymn. There was no rush, no urgency, only the quiet rhythm of people reconnecting with their faith, their thoughts, and perhaps even each other. As the service drew to an end and Barron stepped out into the open air, the late afternoon sunlight bathed the church's worn stone steps in golden light. The warmth of the sun seemed to extend its embrace to the entire scene. The tall trees lining the cobblestone path, the faint sound of birdsong, and even the faint hum of distant traffic. Everything seemed brighter, more alive, as though the simple exchange within the church had sent ripples of change far beyond its walls. Barron paused at the top of the steps, looking down at the path ahead. It was just an ordinary afternoon in many ways, but it felt extraordinary for him and for everyone who had been in that church. Something small but profound had shifted. A single act, listening, had changed the trajectory of not just one man's emotions but the atmosphere of an entire room. He descended the steps slowly, his thoughts lingering on the power of empathy. How often, he wondered, do we truly stop to listen to one another, to step outside of our own assumptions and take the time to understand the pain, the struggles, and the humanity in others? The sunlight cast long shadows on the ground, but Barron felt no weight in them. Perhaps, he thought, in a world so filled with noise, division, and chaos, what people needed most wasn't answers or grand gestures. Maybe all they needed was a little kindness, a reminder that, deep down, we aren't as different from one another as we might think. As he walked away from the church, he carried the memory of the moment with him, its quiet significance like a flame burning steadily in his heart. A simple gesture, a shared moment of understanding, a reminder that even the smallest acts of empathy could have a far-reaching impact.